You are listening to Ashes and Candlelight, a place for quiet stories told in the dark, where the noise of the day can soften at the edges. If you're settling down to sleep, let the world around you slow a little. There's nothing you need to do except follow the sound of the story, or let it drift past you while rest arrives in its own time. Tonight, we're going somewhere still and bright, to a city balanced between water and sky. Before fear, before walls and waiting, before time itself became a measure of safety. This is Venice as it once was, a place of movement and trade, of bells and voices, of narrow streets opening suddenly onto light. You don't need to remember names or dates. You don't need to stay awake. Just listen as we step quietly into the city and let it come into view, one breath at a time. When you're ready, we'll begin. Venice did not wake all at once. It never had. The city stirred in pieces, as if each part were listening for the others before moving. A shutter creaked open somewhere above the water. A rope loosened. An oar dipped once, testing the morning. Before the streets, there was the lagoon, a wide, shallow body of water, neither sea nor land, breathing in slow, patient cycles. At dawn, it smelled faintly of salt and wet wood. Mud showed itself briefly between the tides, then disappeared again, as it had for centuries. The lagoon was never still. Even when it appeared calm, it shifted beneath the surface, responding to distant winds, distant moons, distant storms that might not reach the city for days. Venice was not built on this place. It was built against it. Beneath the city, hidden below the waterline, stood a forest no one could see. Millions of wooden piles, driven deep into the mud, packed so closely together that the ground itself became firm. Oak, alder, larch, trees that had once grown in mountain soil or river valleys far inland, were cut, stripped, and floated here, lowered into darkness, pressed downward until they could go no further. They did not rot. The absence of air preserved them. Water, paradoxically, kept them strong. Above them rose stone, churches, houses, warehouses, all resting on patience rather than depth. Every building was an agreement between weight and balance, between water and restraint. Nothing stood alone. Each wall depended on the next. Each foundation relied on thousands of unseen supports. The Venetians understood this arrangement instinctively. They knew the water was not an enemy to be conquered, but a presence to be managed. Every tide was read. Every change was noted. Marks were scratched into stone to measure high water. Timbers were checked by touch. Boats were adjusted by habit rather than calculation. The city learned to move when the lagoon allowed it, and to wait when it did not. As the light strengthened, colour returned slowly. Pale stone warmed from grey to gold. Green water darkened beneath bridges. The sky, low and wide, reflected itself everywhere at once, in canals, in windows, in polished brass. Venice did not brighten quickly. It revealed itself in stages. First the water, then the stone, then the people. There were no carts to announce the day, No wheels to hurry it along. Instead, sound travelled by water. The hollow knock of wood against wood. The low call of a boatman passing beneath a bridge. The soft slap of waves against stone steps worn smooth by generations of feet. Footsteps echoed longer here. Voices carried farther than expected. A word spoken across a canal lingered, suspended between walls, before reaching the ear. Venice measured itself in these sounds. The city had no single centre. It unfolded in fragments, islands stitched together by bridges, neighbourhoods divided by canals narrow enough to speak across. Here, distance was not counted in miles, but in crossings, in turns taken slowly, carefully, in familiar routes followed without hurry. Movement was deliberate. Goods arrived by boat and left the same way. Water carried everything: people, food, messages, rumours, sacks of grain, barrels of wine, bales of cloth bound for other ports. The lagoon was both road and border. It connected Venice to the world and insulated it from it at the same time. It was a city that floated not because it drifted, but because it stayed balanced. Even the buildings leaned into this logic. Doors opened directly onto canals. Steps descended into water rather than onto streets. Storehouses faced the tide, not the road. Foundations were checked and rechecked, not because collapse was expected, but because vigilance was habit. Venice had learned early that survival required attention. Nothing here was accidental. Nothing was wasted. Fresh water was collected carefully. Waste was removed with equal care. Space was precious, measured, shared. The city existed because it was managed, not once, but continuously. Above the lagoon, the first bells rang, not as a command, but as a signal. A shared acknowledgement that the day had begun. Different bells spoke to different parts of the city. Parish bells, work bells, monastic bells that marked time in prayer rather than labour. They overlapped briefly, then settled into a familiar rhythm. Windows opened wider. Someone shook out a cloth. A boat slid away from a landing with a slow, practiced push. Life resumed, exactly as it had the day before. And the day before that. This was a city that believed in continuity, not permanence. Venetians knew better than that. But repetition. The quiet faith that if things were done in the right order, at the right pace, tomorrow would resemble today closely enough to be trusted. Beneath the water, the wooden forest held. Above it, stone endured. Between them, water moved back and forth, counting time in its own way. Venice floated. And for now, that was enough. By the time the light reached the upper windows, the city was already awake. Not in any single moment, not with a signal or a sound that could be named, but in the way a body wakes, gradually, unevenly, each part responding in its own time. Along the canals, the water moved first. It shifted almost imperceptibly, nudged by tide and wind, carrying reflections that stretched and loosened as the sky brightened. The buildings leaned into their own images, red brick and pale stone wavering gently below. Boats passed before most doors were opened. Small working vessels slipped through the narrower canals, their hulls worn smooth by years of use. Oars entered the water without splash, guided by hands that needed no instruction. The routes were memorized long ago, learned through repetition rather than effort. Above the waterline, shutters began to open. One, then another. A window lifted on the second floor of a house whose lower level had long since surrendered to damp and tide. Someone leaned out briefly, scanning the canal, then withdrew again. Nothing required comment. In courtyards, hidden from the main streets, footsteps crossed stone, keys turned in locks. A door opened and closed softly, careful not to disturb those still sleeping above. Venice did not reward haste, and no one hurried where patience served better. Near the markets, the air thickened with familiar scents, bread baking in ovens that had never fully cooled, smoke rising in narrow threads, catching briefly in the mist before dispersing. Fish laid out on stone slabs, their scales dull in the early light, arranged with a care that suggested habit rather than pride. Merchants arrived without ceremony. They lifted shutters, secured awnings, and checked the contents of crates already counted many times before. Cloth was unrolled and smoothed. Grain was measured. Scales were tested, weights adjusted, balances nudged until they settled evenly. Ledgers lay open on wooden counters, their pages marked with symbols and numbers that meant more than words. A mark for arrival, a mark for sale, a mark for debt. The books recorded what the city already knew. That movement was life and stillness, something to be managed. Bells sounded from different parts of the city, never together. A single bell from a parish church, then another answering at a distance. Their tones crossed above the water, faded into the stone, and were absorbed without comment. Time was marked, not commanded. Further out, near the edge of the lagoon, larger ships waited with their sails lowered. Their hulls sat heavy in the water, burdened with cargo from places spoken of daily, but rarely imagined in detail. Timber from the north, wool and cloth from inland towns, spices carried across routes that had become stories of their own. Some ships prepared to depart. Sailors checked rigging, folded canvas, and made small repairs where wear had revealed itself. Knots were tested, lines coiled. The work was quiet and repetitive, passed down rather than taught. No one spoke of distance. Constantinople was not far in the mind, nor Alexandria distant. These places existed not as destinations, but as parts of a rhythm, arrivals and departures stitched together by tide and trade. Every canal fed this movement. Narrow passages opened suddenly into wider ones, then narrowed again, guiding traffic in patterns that felt instinctive rather than planned. Warehouses opened directly onto the water, their doors scarred by use, their interiors cool and dim. Goods moved inward as others moved out. Crates were lifted and set down. Barrels rolled, paused, rolled again. Nothing was wasted, least of all time. Above, in rooms that looked onto the canals, daily life continued without ceremony. Beds were made. Clothing was chosen with little thought. Water was poured into basins. a face studied briefly in polished metal, then turned away. Children woke slowly, some already accustomed to the rhythm of the city, others resisting it. A voice called softly from another room. A bowl was set on a table, a piece of bread broken and shared. Venice was a city built on balance, between water and stone, trade and tradition, movement and restraint. Every action, no matter how small, relied on the next. A delayed boat affected a delivery. A late delivery altered a market. A market shift rippled outward, touching lives far from the canal where it began. And yet, none of this felt fragile. The city trusted its own patterns. It trusted the tides to return. It trusted the ships to come back. It trusted that the ledgers would continue to make sense tomorrow, as they had yesterday. This trust was not spoken. It did not need to be. Venice had learned, over generations, how to exist in motion without appearing restless. The water moved constantly, but the city remained. The people passed through markets and doorways and years, but the routines held them together. By mid-morning, the mist thinned. Light reached deeper into the streets, touching brick and plaster, catching on the edges of balconies and carved stone. The city looked as it always did, familiar, enduring, unconcerned with change. No one paused to consider what lay beyond the horizon of the day. There was work to be done, goods to be moved, accounts to be kept. The city had awakened, and it did so believing, without question, that this rhythm would continue. Venice was built for feet and water, nothing else. There were no roads wide enough for carts, no rutted tracks worn smooth by iron rims. Stone pathways narrowed suddenly, turned sharply, ended without warning at water. Bridges arched high and steep, shaped for boats to pass beneath, not for animals to climb easily across. The city rejected wheels by design. To move through Venice was to slow down. A person walked, stopped, crossed, waited. A boat glided, paused, turned, drifted. Every journey was broken into small acts of patience. This shaped the body as much as the map. People learned to carry things differently here. Loads were balanced across shoulders, shifted from hand to hand, lifted and lowered often. Deliveries arrived in stages, from ship to quay, from quay to boat, from boat to doorstep. Nothing arrived quickly. Everything arrived intact. In the mornings, porters gathered near the larger landings. Some leaned against stone with their ropes already looped across one shoulder. Others stood quietly, watching the water, waiting to be chosen. Grain sacks, oil barrels, bundles of cloth. Each load would pass through several bodies before reaching its final place. A man might carry the same crate only as far as the next bridge, set it down, wipe his hands, and watch it lifted again by someone else. Movement created work. Where other cities relied on animals and wheels, Venice relied on people. This made the city dense with labour. A short stretch of canal could support boatmen, stevedores, rope makers, sail repairers, carpenters, fishmongers, traders, clerks. The water carried not only goods, but voices, instructions, greetings, prices called across the narrow gaps between boats and windows. The sound rarely settled. Even when streets grew quiet, water continued to speak. Oars dipped and lifted. Hulls knocked softly against stone. Ropes tightened, loosened, creaked. Somewhere nearby, a pulley turned, lifting cargo from a hold into the light. Venice listened to itself constantly. This constant movement gave the city an advantage that was easy to miss. Goods did not linger long in one place. Storage was temporary, spread out, provisional. Grain passed through warehouses rather than into them. Spices were unpacked, weighed, repacked, and sent on. The city lived by circulation. Stillness caused problems here. Water that stopped moving became foul. Goods that sat too long spoiled. Money left untouched lost its use. Venice learned this without theory. Its markets reflected the same logic. Stalls clustered tightly, selling similar wares side by side. Prices shifted with the morning's arrivals. A delayed ship could be felt before it was seen. Nothing was distant. The Rialto did not feel like a seat of power. It felt like a joint, a place where things bent and turned. News travelled as quickly as coin. Merchants learned to read faces as carefully as ledgers, to notice what was withheld as much as what was declared. This attention became habit. Venetians were said to be calculating, but it was less ambition than care. In a city like this, carelessness showed itself quickly. A loose knot, a mistimed crossing, a poorly judged tide could undo a day's work. Children learned early. They knew which steps were slick at low tide, which bridges caught the wind, which alleys flooded first after heavy rain. They learned water by sound as much as sight, the difference between a safe channel and a shallow one, between movement and trouble. Venice trained its people quietly. The absence of wheels also changed time. Elsewhere, distance yielded to speed. Here, distance asked effort. A short journey might take longer than expected, shaped by tide, traffic, or weather. Plans remained loose by necessity. Appointments were approximate. Waiting was ordinary. The city moved constantly, but it did not hurry. Authority adapted to this rhythm. Announcements travelled by bell, by voice, by notices placed where people already passed. Officials arrived on foot or by boat, visible, recognizable. Power was present, but rarely sudden. Architecture reinforced this closeness. Government buildings did not dominate from above. They stood embedded in daily movement. The Doge's palace opened onto the water. Courtyards and colonnades invited passage rather than blocked it. Venice governed by proximity. Homes followed the same pattern. Doors opened onto canals. Windows looked down onto water traffic as naturally as onto streets. Workshops, warehouses, and living spaces overlapped. A boat might be tied just outside a sleeping room. Privacy existed, but it was thin. Lives brushed against one another constantly. Reputation mattered. Disputes unfolded in public. Word travelled fast in a city that carried sound so efficiently. Carelessness lingered longer here than elsewhere. Venice remembered. Records were kept carefully. Contracts copied. Cargoes listed. Ship movements logged. Names written down and checked again. Paper mattered. Memory was formalised early, turned into archive. This was not sentiment, it was protection. A city built on water required proof. All of this produced resilience. Venice did not rely on a single road, a single gate, a single route of supply. Goods arrived by many paths. Labour shifted as needed. Information often moved faster than physical change. The city bent, but bending had its cost. The same density that sustained trade also narrowed distance between bodies. The same movement that enriched the city connected it endlessly. Hands passed crates, boats shared space. Voices travelled farther than intended. Strength and exposure lived together. For now, the risk remained unseen. Boats continued to arrive. Bells continued to mark the day. Markets hummed. Water moved in and out with the tide. Patient, unremarkable. Venice trusted its balance. It had survived floods and fires, wars and upheavals. It had learned to live with uncertainty and call it ordinary. The lagoon had taught that lesson slowly. What it had not yet learned was how quickly balance could shift. Not through collapse, but through accumulation. Not through a single failure, but through countless small contacts. For now, the city moved as it always had. Feet on stone, hands on rope, water carrying everything else, and the wheels, absent as ever, did not turn. Venice did not imagine itself as powerful. It thought of itself as precise. Power was something loud cities claimed. Cities with walls and armies, banners and proclamations. While Venice preferred quieter measures. Weight, distance, time, risk. The city learned early that what mattered most was not where something came from, but what could be expected of it. A ship was not a story. It was a calculation. Cargoes were discussed long before they arrived. Contracts were written months in advance, their terms shaped by winds that had not yet blown and seas that had not yet turned. A voyage to Alexandria or Constantinople existed first as ink on parchment, then as obligation. By the time a hull appeared on the horizon, much of its meaning had already been decided. This way of thinking changed how the world felt. Places became entries, cities became margins, and distance lost its texture as it gained a value. What mattered was not the colour of a foreign shore or the sound of its streets, but how reliably it could be reached, how often it failed, and at what cost. Venice did not need to see the world to act upon it. The city's true engine sat indoors. In counting houses and offices, clerks bent over ledgers ruled with lines and columns, recording arrivals and absences with equal care. Ink moved steadily and quietly, converting movement into record. Ships were logged, cargoes listed, losses noted without drama. Paper absorbed uncertainty so that the city did not have to. This habit of record keeping ran deep. Agreements were copied, notarized, and archived. A promise spoken once was not trusted. A promise written twice was better, and a promise written 3 times, witnessed, sealed, and stored, could outlast a man. Venice built memory into its walls. Archives grew alongside warehouses. The city remembered itself through paper as much as stone. Names were preserved, routes repeated, patterns studied. From this accumulation came foresight. A delayed convoy from the Black Sea was not a surprise, but a variation. A poor harvest in the hinterland did not bring panic. It prompted adjustment. The city did not wait for crises to announce themselves. It anticipated them quietly, through comparison. This gave Venice a peculiar calm. Disruption did not arrive as shock, but as pressure. Shortages were felt gradually. Prices rose in increments. Substitutions were found, and the city adapted not by resisting change, but by absorbing it. Loss was expected. Every venture accounted for it. Every contract allowed for absence, damage, and delay. The sea was never assumed to be kind, only tolerable. This expectation shaped the Venetian temperament. Risk was not romanticized. It was managed. Men who sailed knew they might not return, and families prepared for this without ceremony. Wills were written early. Debts were settled promptly. The city did not dwell on catastrophe. It planned around it. This planning extended outward. Venice's reach was long, but it was rarely forceful. Control came not from occupation, but from dependence. Cities that relied on Venetian shipping, Venetian credit, and Venetian distribution became entangled willingly. Influence spread through reliability. To trade with Venice was to accept its rhythms, its measures, its paperwork. Time itself bent slightly to Venetian custom. Deadlines counted in weeks and tides rather than days. Obligations framed by seasons rather than dates. The world learned to wait with Venice. This waiting was structured. Quays were organised, warehouses assigned, schedules staggered, so that no single arrival overwhelmed the system, and nothing was designed to arrive alone. Goods moved through layers of handling, inspection, and redistribution. Everything passed through hands trained to assess without attachment. Grain sacks were weighed and reweighed. Oil was tested for purity. Cloth was unrolled, inspected, folded again. Decisions were made quickly, then recorded carefully. The work was repetitive. Repetition bred trust, and trust allowed distance to stretch further still. A merchant could invest in a cargo he would never see, carried by sailors he would never meet, bound for a port he could not describe, and sleep soundly, knowing the system would account for him. This was Venice's quiet triumph. But this abstraction carried a cost. The further the city's interests reached, the thinner its emotional connection became. Losses were counted, not mourned. A storm in distant waters meant figures adjusted in a ledger, not candles lit in a chapel. Suffering happened elsewhere. Venice knew of it, but indirectly, as interruption, shortage, deviation. Its human weight filtered through process until it became manageable. This distance was not cruelty. It was insulation. The city protected itself from overwhelm by translating experience into administration. Pain became data. Fear became contingency. Over time, this changed how Venetians thought about responsibility. They felt accountable to systems rather than individuals, to balances rather than faces. Decisions were judged by outcome, not by intention. If harm occurred but the ledger remained stable, the system was considered sound. This logic held until it did not. Because systems that excel at managing loss struggle when loss multiplies suddenly. Venice's engine was elegant, but it depended on continuity, on flow, on the assumption that disruption would arrive in increments small enough to be absorbed. What it did not yet imagine was accumulation. Not one failure, but many. Not one delay, but countless. Not one absence, but a pattern of them. For now, the engine ran smoothly. Ink dried, pages turned, ships departed and arrived, figures balanced. The city felt secure, not because it was invulnerable, but because it was prepared, and preparation, long practiced, felt like permanence. Venice believed the world could be measured. It had not yet learned what happened when measurement failed. Venice was crowded by design. It had grown that way slowly, not through pressure or conquest, but through habit. Islands stitched together by bridges left little space for separation. Water-narrowed movement, folded paths inward, brought people repeatedly into the same places at the same times. Closeness was not an accident here. It was the shape the city had taken. Venetians learned early how to live near one another. They learned how to pass on steps without collision, how to pause in doorways, how to wait while a boat cleared a narrow canal. The city trained its people in small courtesies that kept bodies moving without friction. Touch was ordinary, and the city trusted it. A shoulder brushed another on a bridge. A hand steadied a crate as it was passed along. Coins changed palms. Knots were tied, untied, retied by different fingers in quick succession. Movement overlapped so that nothing remained isolated for long. Beneath it all lay a quiet coordination. Markets compressed the city further. At the Rialto, voices layered over one another, sellers calling prices, buyers negotiating, porters shouting warnings as they moved through the crowd. The air carried smells of fish, grain, oil, damp wood, and smoke, all blending into something familiar enough to be ignored. People stood close, simply because there was nowhere else to stand. Stalls leaned inward, boats pressed against quays. Goods were unpacked and repacked within arm's reach of strangers. A sack of grain might be lifted by half a dozen people before it reached its place, each trusting the others to keep hold, to carry their share of the weight. This trust was born of necessity rather than feeling. Venetians did not assume goodwill, they assumed repetition. They trusted that what had worked yesterday would work again today, because it had done so many times before. Familiarity bred confidence, and confidence allowed proximity. The city functioned because people expected one another to behave predictably. Homes reflected this closeness. Families lived above workshops, above warehouses, above rooms where goods were stored temporarily before being moved on. Windows opened onto canals, where boats passed so near that conversations could be exchanged without raising voices. Private life unfolded in view of others, separated by little more than height or habit. Privacy existed, but it was porous. Children grew up learning the rhythms of neighbours as well as their own households. They knew when shutters opened, when bread was baked, when boats returned. They learned who could be relied upon for help, and who required watching. Knowledge spread quietly, carried by repetition rather than announcement. This density gave the city warmth. In winter, bodies gathered for heat. In summer, shade was shared. During festivals and processions, crowds pressed together willingly, moving as one through streets too narrow to allow distance. Bells rang, voices rose, and the city seemed to thicken with life. Venice felt alive because it was full, but fullness has a cost. The same closeness that supported work and trade also erased buffers. There was little space for withdrawal, little room for isolation. A disturbance in one quarter travelled quickly to the next, carried by voices, by water, by habit. Rumours moved faster than boats. A delayed arrival was known before it was seen. A missing ship altered prices before it altered expectations. A problem in one place became a topic everywhere else, discussed in doorways, across canals, at market stalls. Information spread because people were already near one another. So did emotion. Concern passed from face to face. Anxiety took hold not as panic, but as tone, a hesitation in conversation. A glance held a fraction longer than usual. The city felt changes in mood as quickly as changes in supply. Venetians paid attention to these shifts without naming them. They were used to reading the city's pulse. Crowding also meant overlap. The same hands touched many things in a single day. A porter might handle grain, then cloth, then rope, then coin, then food, moving continuously from task to task. A merchant might speak with dozens of people before midday, exchanging greetings, instructions, agreements. No interaction stood alone, for everything was connected by sequence. This interweaving made the city resilient. If one person faltered, another stepped in. If a route was blocked, another was found. Work continued because it was distributed, shared, repeated. But it also meant that interruption rarely stayed contained. When something went wrong, it did not stop at a single door or key. It passed outward, quietly, through the same channels that usually carried prosperity. Venice thrived on closeness, largely because it had to. A city built on fragments could not afford the luxury of distance. Yet closeness required faith. Faith that bodies could pass safely. Faith that shared air was harmless. Faith that what was familiar could not suddenly become dangerous. These beliefs were not argued, they were lived. Over time, they hardened into instinct. People did not ask whether proximity carried risk, because proximity was the condition of life. To question it would be to question the city itself, and the city had endured. It had survived floods and fires, wars and political upheaval, all while remaining full. Crowds had gathered for centuries without consequence beyond the ordinary injuries of daily life. There was no memory of closeness betraying them. So fear took a particular shape here. Venetians feared disruption more than danger. They feared breakdowns in routine, interruptions in flow, absences that could not be explained. They feared storms that scattered ships, shortages that forced rationing, moments when the system stuttered. They did not fear one another. Not yet. The city's confidence rested on continuity, on the assumption that tomorrow would resemble today closely enough to be navigable, that routines would repeat, that hands would meet the same objects in the same order. What Venetians feared most was not catastrophe, but imbalance. And imbalance, when it came, would not announce itself loudly. It would arrive quietly, through the same closeness that had always sustained them, through the same shared steps, shared air, shared work, through accumulation rather than shock. Not one contact, but many. Not one failure, but a pattern of them. For now, though, nothing appeared amiss. Crowds moved. Markets functioned. Boats arrived and departed. Crowds moved. Markets functioned. Boats arrived and departed. Bells rang. The city remained full, and fullness still felt like safety. Venice trusted what it could see and feel. It had not yet learned to fear what moved invisibly among those it held closest. When night came to Venice, it did not arrive all at once. There was no single moment when the city turned from day to dark. Instead, the light thinned gradually, retreating from the wider spaces first. The lagoon lost its colour before the streets did. The sky dimmed into a softer grey, then deepened slowly, as if testing its weight. Windows began to glow one by one. They lit individually, each according to its own habit. A lamp lit in an upper room, where someone lingered over a ledger. Another in a kitchen where bread was being cut. A third in a narrow workshop where tools were put away carefully, counted before sleep. Night entered Venice through these small domestic acts. As daylight faded, movement changed its character. Boats still passed along the canals, but more quietly now, their journeys shorter, more purposeful. Oars dipped with less splash. Voices dropped. The water carried sound more clearly at night, and people knew it. A conversation held too loudly would travel further than intended. Streets emptied unevenly. Some alleys fell silent early, while others remained gently active, especially near inns, or along routes where goods had arrived late and still needed storing. Doors closed, bars were set, shutters drawn. The city folded itself inward. Public life simply thinned, leaving behind a smaller version of itself. A city scaled for footsteps rather than crowds, for recognition rather than anonymity. Faces became familiar again. Those who remained outside after dark were often known to one another. Venice at night belonged less to trade and more to presence. Light came from flame. Oil lamps hung from brackets, their glass chimneys clouded by use. Candles burned in windows, set carefully to avoid drafts. Lanterns were carried low, close to the body, their glow bouncing off stone and water alike. The light, too soft to banish the darkness entirely, carved out small islands of visibility. A doorway, a stretch of paving, or the curved edge of a bridge. Beyond that, the city receded into shadow, still present but less defined. This changed how people moved. Steps slowed. Hands brushed walls for guidance. The familiar geography of the city, learned by daylight, became something navigated by memory and touch. Corners were taken carefully. Bridges approached with awareness. Night rewarded attentiveness. The canals themselves grew darker, their surfaces smoothing as traffic diminished. Reflections lengthened. A single lamp could stretch across the water, broken gently by the passing of a boat or the ripple of a tide turning. In these hours, Venice seemed to listen to itself. Sounds that vanished during the day returned. The distant call of a watchman, the clink of a rope against a mooring post, the quiet splash of water against steps, more audible now that the larger noises had fallen away. Even the city's buildings sounded different at night. Stone released the warmth it had gathered during the day. Wood shifted slightly as temperatures changed. Somewhere, a beam creaked. A shutter tapped softly in a breeze moving down a narrow canal. These sounds felt less like disturbances and more like reassurances. They told the city it was still held together. Inside homes, the rhythm changed again. Families gathered closer. Meals were simpler now, less hurried. The tools of the day were set aside. Accounts closed. Letters folded. Candles burned lower, trimmed to make them last. Sleep was not immediate. It arrived gradually, differently for each household. Some rooms fell quiet early, while others lingered in low conversation, the exchange of small stories that had no place in daylight hours. Venice allowed this unhurried descent. There was no expectation that night should be productive. The city that measured everything so carefully by day relaxed its grip after dark. Time loosened, deadlines dissolved. What remained was presence, being somewhere with someone without obligation pressing close. Even authority softened. Guards patrolled, but without urgency. Their task was less to intervene than to witness, to ensure that the city's quiet continued uninterrupted. They moved slowly, listening more than looking, guided by sound and familiarity. Law at night was discreet. The absence of wheels, so noticeable by day, became even more pronounced now. Without carts or animals, the city rested more fully. No rumble echoed between walls. No hooves struck stone. Only footsteps, measured and few. Yet within this quiet, the city remained full. Behind closed doors, the city remained alive. Breath moved, dreams formed, illness stirred, children shifted in sleep. The same closeness that defined Venice by day remained, only softened by darkness. Walls were thin, distances were short, lives remained adjacent. Night did not separate the city, it pressed it gently together, and above it all, the lagoon continued its slow work. Tides turned without regard for sleep. Water rose and fell as it always had, touching the same stones, retreating from the same steps. The city floated through the night as steadily as it did through the day. This continuity was comforting. Venice had learned to trust the dark, largely because it was familiar. Night came every day. It passed. Morning returned. The city believed this rhythm to be reliable. What it did not yet understand was how fragile that trust could be, how easily the familiar could change without announcing itself, how something carried quietly, moving through the same routes as trade and water and breath, might arrive unnoticed. For now, though, Venice slept. Lights dimmed and voices faded, while the canals held their reflections, and the city, balanced between stone and water, rested in the dark, unaware of what else the night might one day bring. Venice slept lightly. It always had. A city built on water never fully surrendered to rest. Even at night, even in the quietest hours, movement continued, slower, softer, but unbroken. Tides shifted beneath foundations. Mooring ropes tightened and eased. Boats nudged stone steps with a patience that felt almost deliberate. Stillness here was always a negotiation. After the lamps were dimmed and the last voices faded from the canals, the city entered a different rhythm. Windows closed, doors were bolted, shutters settled into place with familiar sounds. Families withdrew inward, folding themselves into rooms shaped by generations of habit. The lagoon exhaled. Water slid back from steps that had been busy all day, revealing darkened stone, slick with moss and time. In narrow alleys, the air cooled. Dampness rose from the ground and clung to walls, softening edges, dulling colour. Venice at night simply thinned, becoming a shadow of itself. Those still awake moved carefully. A boatman guiding a late passage used shorter strokes, careful not to let the oar ring against a stone. A watchman crossed a bridge slowly, lantern held low, light caught and scattered by mist. Somewhere, a door opened briefly, then closed again, sealing warmth inside. The city trusted these small continuities. They were signs that everything remained as it should be. Inside homes, life narrowed to essentials: a final meal, quiet conversation, the sorting of goods brought in that day. A ledger reviewed once more, not out of urgency, but routine. Ink dried. Pages were turned. Nothing demanded attention beyond what had already been given. Venice believed deeply in routine. It was how the city maintained balance. When days repeated, uncertainty felt manageable. Disruption, when it came, usually announced itself early. A delayed ship, a rising price, a rumour moving ahead of fact. There was time to adjust, to redistribute, to absorb. Night reinforced this belief. It offered a pause between assessments, a quiet space where nothing needed to be decided. Problems could wait until morning. Risks would still be there when the bells rang again. And so people slept. They slept lightly, yet sufficiently. They slept above warehouses, filled with goods that had passed inspection. Above canals that carried trade rather than threat. Above ledgers that balanced neatly at the end of the day. The city felt complete. From the towers and rooftops, Venice looked unchanged. The same dark lattice of islands. The same reflective surfaces catching moonlight and starlight. The same familiar silhouettes of domes and chimneys rising from water. Nothing in the outline suggested fragility. Nothing in the quiet hinted at consequence. Venice had lived through nights like this for centuries. Storms had passed. Fires had burned out. Enemies had threatened and failed. Each time, the city had absorbed disruption and returned to form. This endurance became expectation. It was easy, in such stillness, to believe that tomorrow would resemble today closely enough to trust, that the careful systems built over generations would continue to hold. That preparation itself was protection. The lagoon offered no contradiction. It moved as it always had, in and out, measuring time by gravity rather than intention. It did not warn, it did not hurry, it simply continued. Beneath the surface, piles remained firm. Above them, stone rested securely. Between them, water flowed without concern for what it carried or what it connected. Venice slept on top of its own confidence. Elsewhere, far beyond the horizon, movement was also continuing. Ships crossed open water. Goods changed hands. People met, parted, travelled onward. Causes accumulated quietly, without announcement, without ceremony. But here, in the city, night smoothed everything flat. Differences dissolved into shadow. Distances shrank. Threats lost their shape. What could not be seen did not demand response. This was a profound act of trust. Trust in systems. Trust in rhythm. Trust in the idea that continuity was the natural state of things. Venice had earned that trust through long practice. It had learned how to live with uncertainty by organising it, recording it, redistributing it until it felt small enough to manage. The city had become adept at turning the unpredictable into process. And for a very long time, that had been enough. On nights like this, nothing pressed inward, nothing disrupted the surface. The city rested in the belief that all significant change arrived gradually, with warning, and could be met with adjustment rather than alarm. The lagoon reflected this calm. Water darkened to ink. Reflections softened. The boundary between solid and liquid blurred gently, without danger. Venice remained suspended between states, half resting, half waiting, balanced. If there was unease, it lay too deep to surface. If there was risk, it moved too slowly to be felt. Everything appeared aligned. The city did not know it was being watched by history. It did not know that the conditions it relied upon, closeness, connection, repetition, were also preparing it for something that would not arrive in increments. For now, there was only night. For now, there was only night, quiet water, dark windows, measured breathing. The belief that morning would come as it always had. And in that belief, Venice slept, lightly, confidently, unaware that stillness can sometimes be the final moment before change begins to move. By the time the night had fully settled, Venice was no longer thinking about the world beyond the lagoon. Windows dimmed one by one. Voices softened, then disappeared. Boats were tied off for the last time, their ropes checked simply by touch. The water continued to move, but more slowly now, its surface smoothing as the wind dropped away. Inside the city, routine took over. Doors were barred, candles were trimmed. Ledgers were closed and stacked where they would be found again in the morning. A final walk through a courtyard, a glance down a canal, a pause to listen for sounds that did not belong, and then the day was allowed to end. Venice trusted this ending. It trusted that the tide would return as it always had, that the bells would ring again, that ships already underway would continue to move through darkness toward familiar quays. It trusted in patterns repeated so often they no longer felt like choices. The city slept lightly, but it slept. Above the waterline, stone held its warmth a little longer. Below it, the wooden forest remained pressed into the mud, unchanged by the passing hours. Between them, water breathed in and out, keeping its own time, indifferent to human concerns. Nothing appeared wrong. Balance, long practiced, felt permanent. Systems refined over generations gave the illusion of certainty. Tomorrow seemed knowable because yesterday had behaved itself, and so the city rested, confident in what it understood. What it could not yet see was how change travelled, not as an interruption, but as a continuation, a slow accumulation carried along the same routes that had always brought comfort and prosperity. For now, though, Venice lay still, water against stone, stone against wood, the lagoon holding everything in place. And in that stillness, the night passed, gently, patiently, as it always had.